been in this industry for 35 years, and I can tell you now, there are some countries and some sectors where it is impossible, not difficult, impossible to do business without paying bribes. And it's getting worse. You've got the Chinese coming in, the Indians, the Russians. Do you think they give a hoot about ethics and bribery? If you really want to implement this across every company in the West, you'd better be prepared to lose all of your business in some countries and a lot of it elsewhere, at least in the short term.
Founded in the United Kingdom during the First World War as an armaments company, Alma Industries initially expanded rapidly throughout the British Commonwealth, Europe and the Americas. It was a true conglomerate, embracing industries as diverse as mining, construction, chemicals, banking, food production and transport and communications. Surviving the Great Depression through sheer size, it gained further success during the Second World War, supplying the Allied armies and fulfilling vast contracts for humanitarian relief in devastated countries at the conclusion of the conflict. But its real glory years were to come in the post-war boom of the 1950s and 1960s, when surging economic activity and huge government budgets combined with closed markets and cosy relationships to treble the group's profits by 1971.
I don't think anybody ever talked about business ethics in those days. Ethics was something which you might have studied had you been one of those bright chaps, going to university. You went out selling for the company and it was your job to get the business in. And that was all about relationships, especially in the third world where these chaps were expected to be looked after. And it was your job to look after them. There's no way you'd succeed otherwise.
But the winds of change blowing through the world weren't just political, but legal and social as well. And companies like Alma, which had hitherto enjoyed free rein to conduct business much as they wished, now found themselves constrained by the beginnings of a new global anti-corruption movement.
In the 1970s and into the 1980s, you start to see an explosion in mass electronic communication, notably television. And you start to see swelling levels of public anger at some of the excesses of the system. You buy this billion-dollar bridge, aircraft program, container port. From me, with the scant resources of your desperately poor country, which have probably been borrowed anyway from an international bank at terrible rates of interest, and which your population will be paying off until the end of time. And as a reward, we will siphon off some of that borrowed cash you pay us into your Swiss bank account for your retirement fund. Some of it would be comical if it wasn't so tragic. Arctic uniforms for the soldiers of tropical nations, warships for landlocked countries, unfinished bridges, roads to nowhere, that sort of thing. So you start to see activism. You see NGOs being formed. You see international treaties and national legislation.
You have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, which for the first time anywhere makes it a criminal offence for an executive in a corporation to bribe a foreign government official. You have the formation in 1993 of Transparency International, the transnational anti-corruption NGO, which hugely raises the profile of these issues. In 1997, you have the OECD Convention for Combating Bribery of Foreign Government Officials in Business Transactions, which requires member states to pass legislation similar to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now, all of these things are ratcheting up the pressure on companies like Alma Industries to refrain from corrupt practices, to basically change the way they do business.
But if the permissive environment in which Alma had always operated was changing, change came more slowly to the company itself. Alex Mulcahy is the former Alma Industries executive who left the company as a direct consequence of what he believed were its illegal activities. As a former sales manager in the industrial equipment division, he has vivid memories of the practices followed in the field.
No, it didn't disappear, it just became less obvious. Whereas before it had been almost amateurish, you know, suitcases full of cash, brown envelopes. And that was because it was allowed to be. There was no need to hide it. It was cash deductible, for Christ's sake. But now it had a veneer of professionalism about it, if I can put it that way.
What do you mean?
A Russian guy I know once told me the rules of corruption, but they can't have been Russian rules, because I already knew them. Never write in an email what you can say on the phone. Never say on the phone what you can say in a meeting. Never say in a meeting what you can imply with the change in the look of your eyes. As far as the operations were concerned, it all became more indirect. So typically, there would be an agent, some guy who was ostensibly there to show you the ropes, guide you through the local customs and regulations, fix contacts and meetings. But his real raison d'etre was to pay the bribes. So he would invoice you for his genuine services plus whatever he had to pay on top. Though obviously not stated on the invoice. So you would pay him, he would pay them. Typically all done through offshore bank accounts.
You would know when a payment had been made because a problem you were experiencing would disappear. I mean, typically in these negotiations, there are a lot of obstacles to be overcome. You know, you need a letter from this ministry, or you need to get a meeting with that ministry, and you'd be trying for weeks, maybe months, and then suddenly the letter's there, or yes, you can meet tomorrow, and then you'd know. Except, of course, you didn't know, technically.
Throughout the first 2 decades of the 21st century, a succession of bribery scandals had engulfed some of the biggest corporate names, resulting in multi-million-dollar fines and settlements for the alleged bribing of government officials in return for the award of lucrative contracts in places as far away as India, Russia, Nigeria, and Indonesia. And the legislative environment had become tougher to handle, with many countries passing new laws, including the United Kingdom with its Bribery Act of 2010.
The UK's Bribery Act of 2010 did all it was supposed to do under the OECD Convention. Most notably, it made it a criminal offence for any public official or executive of a private corporation to offer, give, solicit, receive, both directly and indirectly, anything of value in exchange for favourable treatment. But, more importantly, it went on to create a new public offence, that of failing to prevent bribery. Now, this is an interesting one, I think, because it shows a degree of understanding by the legislators about how a criminal offence is likely to occur within a corporation.
It is notoriously difficult to convict corporations of serious criminal offences. The acts themselves are usually undertaken by individuals way down the food chain, a long way from head office. Now, their actions are immediately denied on the grounds that, well, legally, they were acting outside of their authority, and that their actions therefore don't bind or implicate the company. In extreme circumstances, this can lead to the creation of corporations which are essentially crimogenic. Targets are set and communicated to employees which are impossible to meet, except by engaging in illegal behaviour. If targets are met and nothing comes to light, all well and good. If illegal behaviour is found out, the management denies knowledge and the employee is hung out to dry.
The UK government issued guidance on what actions a company could take to demonstrate that it was taking sufficient steps to prevent bribery. These were known as adequate procedures, and they included a chief executive's statement to all staff on building a culture of anti-corruption, the appointment of an anti-corruption compliance officer, the institution of a code of business ethics, the adoption of risk procedures to assess corruption risks within the corporation's business, procedures for vetting and disciplining staff, a gifts and hospitality policy, a training program for all relevant staff, a due diligence process for assessing corruption risks in potential business partners and agents, and a whistleblowing policy, providing protection for staff members reporting incidents of corruption in good faith. By the time of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent economic crisis of 2020 to 23, companies like Alna had been living with these rules for a decade or more. And as the recession eased and growth started to return, the Alma board and its then chief executive, Philip Meynell, decided to renew their anti-corruption credentials with a global anti-corruption program. But there were those inside the company who were doubtful from the start.
I think what was missing for me right from the get-go was even any hint of soul searching. You know, anyone who worked in the company was aware that this would entail a major change in the way that business was done in certain countries. But you know, there was no debate about that at all in Alna. Suddenly this programme was announced with a fanfare, and there were posters all over the place about core values and a training session that all the staff had to attend, and all this stuff. And I know I wasn't the only one who was thinking, how's this all going to play out in practice in Nigeria or Indonesia or Bizan?
It was ridiculous. That's the only word for it. You had grown men in T-shirts saying zero tolerance, listening to a 28-year-old consultant going on about the evils of corruption, when they knew that money was being paid to win contracts. You want to talk to me about corruption? Go to an African country and see the guy in the £4,000 Savile Row suit and the Rolex watch stepping out of his Mercedes Benz to tell you what the fee is for even getting in on the bidding, and then walk down the road to the shanty town of 100,000 people. No running water, no sanitation, no basic health care, and I'm wearing a T-shirt saying zero tolerance.
This balancing act came at a difficult time for Alna Industries. Emerging from the recession, the company was fighting hard to regain lost revenues and defend its market share against increasingly voracious competitors, particularly companies from countries who didn't see the need to play by the same rules. Chief Executive Meynell and the board were under huge pressure to hit aggressive earnings targets being demanded by investors and pension funds desperate to maximize the value of their returns.
Revenue, 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 revenue. Growth, 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 growth. The pressure is relentless. And remember, Alna Industries is not some Google or Microsoft where the money just appears in your bank account because of some killer app invented by an 18-year-old 15 years ago. It's a big, old company with 100,000 employees, with factories and furnaces and production lines costing millions, hundreds of millions each year. It makes things, and it has to be able to sell those things anywhere and to anyone who will buy them. I think Philip Meynell and the board can be viewed as rather unfortunate figures. They're judged solely on the financial returns they make for their investors, so they know they must increase profits. Yet here they are having to do something which they know will almost certainly, in the short term at least, reduce profits. And remember, shareholders aren't subject to this duty to prevent bribery. No one's going to investigate and charge them if it's discovered that they sold their investments in a company that earned less than it might have done because it refused to pay bribes.
One of the key requirements of Alma's anti-corruption policy was a requirement that all counterparties, agents and intermediaries involved in the potential project should be the subject of due diligence to establish their integrity credentials and, in particular, the absence of criminal convictions or credible media or market reports in relation to corrupt practices. To comply with this requirement, the business units used an online tool provided by the Compliance Department, capable of screening the name of any individual or company against internationally recognized blacklists of those convicted of or suspected of criminal behavior. But the system